Have you ever heard the sound a scalpel makes as it slides over bone? If you haven't, it's a little like a knife scraping over a hollow rock. The bone isn't as solid as you might think, not as solid as the blade at least, and the sound has an eerie quality to it. The more I reflect on the sound, the more it reminds me of nails on a chalkboard or sidewalk chalk that kids drag over pavement. It's a weird noise that sets your hair on edge, makes you grit your teeth against the intrusive grinding. I've had a lot of time to think about that sound in the years following my wife's death. That was the sound that woke me up that night. It had been a long week. The department had been reeling over a series of brutal murders, and this was the first night I'd gotten to sleep in my own bed. I had been crashing in the break room, sleeping in my car, living one cup of coffee at a time, while we tried to catch this sadistic son of a bitch. I know many cops in the same situation, but as most of us are locals, the desire to see this guy brought to justice was palpable. The killer had been sticking to a specific area. My area, actually. He was killing with no pattern, no particular demographic, but he seemed to be sticking to victims in this particular part of town. They were low to middle income families, people who couldn't just afford to up and leave because a crazy killer was on the loose, no matter how heinous the crimes were. And the crimes were particularly heinous. 7 different victims, none of them having anything in common, had been found with their faces skinned down to the bone and removed. The whole face. It was as though someone had cut the face off, skinned it to the skull, and took it with them when they left. Nothing was ever taken from the apartments. No messages were left. The killer never lingered after doing their strange deed. We called him a killer, but the victims were usually still alive when he left. They died from blood loss afterwards, sometimes living for hours, lying there as they watched their life leak away and screamed wetly. The last one was a store owner, well liked in the community too. The one before that was an 80-year-old grandmother. Before that it was a 19-year-old girl who was popular with the boys in the neighborhood. A bike messenger, a beat cop, an aspiring actress, a high school student who was once a beauty queen. None of these people had even known each other. There was no connection between them except for where they lived, and no one could find a single person that any of them knew in common. The only connection seemed to be that they were all well liked. I had been sent home that night, Captain telling me that I looked like crap and I needed to sleep in a real bed. My wife had been waiting for me. Captain Weems may have called her before I left, and the night had been a good one. She had saved me some dinner, roast, potatoes, things I liked, and we had cuddled on the couch as we watched something on Netflix. As tired as I was, I remember feeling warm just the same as I spent the night with her. When she looked up at me, her head pillowed in my lap, I remember thinking I was the luckiest guy in the world. When I fell asleep after a rather heated session of lovemaking, I found myself looking forward to the next day, hoping that we could catch this guy and get rid of some of the fear that was hanging around like a cloud. When I came awake, it was because of the scraping noise. Some nights, I wish I had just stayed asleep. I lay awake for a few seconds, listening to the scraping sound and wondering what it could be. It was such an alien noise, like a nail dragged across a window. There was an underlying sound as well, a low, muffled sound like someone having a bad dream. I rolled on my side, thinking my wife was having a nightmare or something, and wanting to comfort her. She was prone to nightmares. Her childhood had been less than ideal, and I wanted to wrap her in my reassuring arms. I found myself unable to move, though. My whole body was heavy, my muscles unresponsive, and all I could do was lie there and listen to her soft groans and husky moans. I was trying to move, but this was different than the usual sleep paralysis somehow. This felt like being out of my body, unable to control it. Then my eyes tracked to the mirror that sat atop my wife's vanity, and I felt a scream hang in my throat like a piece of meat. I was choking on the scream as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. It was a dream. It had to be. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. This was a nightmare. Maybe I was even the one making these noises that I was hearing. This simply couldn't be happening. I was dreaming. I was nightmaring. I would wake up. This would all go away. The longer it went on, though, the more I concluded that it had to be happening. The thing reflected in the mirror was nearly 7 feet tall. It crouched in the bedroom, leaning over my wife, as it slid one long finger over her face. Its head was large, like a big gray baby doll head, with the face covered by a grotesque mask that looked plastered on. There was a spread of red around the mask's corners, and it looked stretched and frayed as it lay pancaked across the creature's face. The creature's body was gray, long and disproportionately slim, on a pair of spindly legs that disappeared below the corner of the bed. What interested me most, however, were the long gray arms that ended in pointy fingers. Fingers he was currently sliding over my wife's face. He was tracing that long finger along the same track, again and again, and I could just see a trickle of blood sliding down one of her cheeks as I watched helplessly. I could see a trench working its way through the skin, the blood beginning to run more freely as he went. His eyes, his overly expressive blue eyes, followed the finger's path as he worked, and I tried with all I had to break out of whatever held me. The too big head looked up from its work, and I realized I was shaking a bit as I watched him. His hand stretched out, impossibly long, and one of those claws came to rest in my ear. It was cold and wet, like a fish that's been plucked from a stream. Suddenly, my shuddering stopped, and I realized why I couldn't move. This thing had done something to me, had done something to my wife. I was forced to lay there and watch as he went about his work. The process was not quick. Whatever tool he had at the end of his wrist was dull indeed. He had to make the circuit for nearly an hour and a half, and my wife's muffled cries were beginning to become more pitiful. The blood was really coming down now, pooling on the bed and turning the white sheet a deep red. I saw my wife starting to shudder, thinking she might come out of it. He touched her with one of those claws, though, putting the tip in her ear, and she went still again. I was going to have to watch as he took her face off. At some point, I think I realized that. All the realizing in the world, though, wouldn't prepare me for it. Finally, after what felt like days, he pulled the finger back and bent over her. He brought both hands up, 10 scalpel fingers peeling the face I had loved so much from her too white skull. That's the other sound I'll never forget. The sound of my wife's face being peeled away sounds like nothing so much as Velcro separating. I saw it in the murky glass as it came free. For just an instant, I could see the creature's face too. It pulled off the old mask, and I realized too late that it was the face of the shopkeeper we had found a few days ago. It put the face in its mouth, and as it chewed, I could see a face like a swollen potato, its mouth like a carved jack-o'-lantern sneer. Its rubbery teeth chewed at the flesh as those eyes stared blankly into space. It had a pair of way too expressive blue eyes, and for a moment I thought they might have come from a doll. They looked at me suddenly, locked mine as I stared into the mirror. Those horrible blue eyes held my gaze for a count of 20 before it slapped the new face on with a wet chuck sound. Those eyes stared back at me through the eye holes of my wife's detached face, and the creature went out through the window without a second look. Those eyes peeking jealously out of my wife's face were the worst part, and that face haunts my dreams every night. By the time I could move, she was already dead. She came out of it before I did, though. She lay on the bed, gasping wetly and calling for me. I didn't know if she could see me. Did her eyes still work? She passed out a few times as she tried to turn her head, finally just laying in her own blood and calling for me softly. She wanted me to save her, wanted me to wake her up from this nightmare. She couldn't be dying in her own bed after having her face cut off. I began to get some feeling back in my arms as her voice trailed away. I could flex my fingers, but my arms didn't seem to want to work until after she had already slipped off. The light had begun to peek in by that time, and I fell out of bed as I scrambled for the phone. I told them everything. I told them about the creature. I told them about its long claws. I told them about the paralyzing dread. I told them how it had taken my wife's face and left out the window. Their response was to send me to a therapist, to give me time to grieve, to have me work with a hypnotherapist, to try to decide if I had actually seen something. I quickly learned that they didn't want to believe what I had seen. They wanted to believe that I had created this monster from my trauma. They wanted me to believe it too, but I wouldn't. I suffered through the bereavement period. I went to the therapists and told them what they wanted to hear. They wanted to tell me that the creature was a way for my mind to cope with what had happened. I knew better, though. I used that downtime to gain information about the creature. There wasn't much to go on. The crimes had all been committed within 2 blocks of each other, all in a central location, all in the part of town that housed several large apartment complexes. I asked around, seeing if anyone had seen anything like it, but I got very few answers. Some of the homeless people told me that they had seen something skulking about lately, but most of them were too strung out to be credible. A few of them led me to an abandoned underground station that had once been central to the area, but now stood abandoned. The homeless didn't stay there anymore, and if they did, they stayed there forever, or so they told me. After a month of bereavement, I came back with the information I had compiled. I was ready to hand it to the chief, but I returned to a very different environment. No one believed that I'd seen a monster steal my wife's face. I began to hear rumbles around the station that I was a suspect now. A 15-year officer had just laid there and watched his wife have her face taken off. Not likely. Seemed more likely that I had been out all night and come home to find her like that. It seemed more likely still that I was the killer, banking on the idea that my reputation would put me above suspicion. I didn't care. I knew what I'd seen, and I took my information straight to my boss. My boss, however, was in another camp altogether. Is this how you spend your period of mourning? I want you fresh, all this monster stuff out of your system. The others, they already think you're unhinged. The ones who don't think it, think you're the killer. You need to be careful talking about this kind of crap around here. Get back to your desk. You're on light duty until further notice. I don't want another word about this damn monster. I seethed behind my desk, already planning my next move. If it was proof they wanted, then it was proof I'd give them. I left early that morning and went to my home to prepare. I packed a bag, took my service pistol, and a shotgun from the hall closet. The little pump action fit nicely in my camp sack, as well as a rope, a flashlight, and some trail bars. I dressed warmly. The November weather was already becoming frigid after dark, and I looked back at my apartment before leaving, unsure if I'd ever see it again. I glanced at my wife's portrait on the mantel, though, and it was enough to send me on my way. This creature wouldn't be wearing her face for long. The old underground was a dilapidated relic, a toothless mouth that gaped out of the pavement. The gate was locked, but I had been told the fence was cut around the back. Some industrious vag had made a neat little hole to scurry through, and I entered the perimeter without much fuss. The sun had begun to set as I flipped on the flashlight, and it cast a red glow across the grimy tiles. The glow was gone after the second staircase, and I was plunged into true darkness. The outside had looked bad, but the inside was a ruin. The tiles had been shattered in places, light fixtures hanging from a leaky roof, and a single train stood like a hulk on a dead track. There was a constant sound of dripping water, a constant sound of scurrying feet, and it was easy to imagine that this was what Bilbo Baggins had found under the Goblin Mountain. I found myself swinging my flashlight around at every sound, my years of cool police training melting away as I descended into the station. Near the tracks, I found a handprint that looked red with dried blood. I jumped down to the tracks without a second thought, drawing my gun and looking right and left. My light fell across a fainted smear going left, light red staining the side of the train. I decided that was my direction. I moved quietly, not wanting to tip my prey off. He could have been hanging over my head for all I knew. If he lived here, he could probably see in the dark, and bringing a beacon with me would be as good as screaming down the tunnel. As I moved, I had little doubt that he knew I was here. The deeper in I went, the worse the scuttling and the skittering became. I told myself it was rats, but how sure was I of that? How sure was I that the scrabbling I heard wasn't the sound of those sharp fingers scraping across the ceiling? How sure was I that that scrabbling was the sound of those equally long toes, toes that I had never seen, gripping the pavement and moving his body along in a quiet scuttle? As I took another corner, I could swear that something big moved just out of my flashlight beam. I held it there for a count of 20 before turning away and continuing down the tunnel. The blood smears were all gone now, but I felt drawn deeper in as I took turns at random. It was almost as if I could hear my wife's voice calling me, and I had little doubt that he knew I was there now. I had even less doubt when he fell on my back, slamming my head down on the floor and sending my gun spinning out of my hand. I blacked out, and when I came to, I really wished I had died. I was laid across a metal bench somewhere deep in the tunnel. An eerie light lit the space, some kind of plant life maybe, and I found that I was paralyzed again. That was when my wife's face, a face made terrible by those two expressive eyes, loomed over me, and I'd have cringed away if I'd been able to move at all. It studied me, maybe it even recognized me, but its regard was terrible, as it came from a face I had loved so much. Her face was decomposed, rotting away as it clung to the creature's skull, and I felt something goopy fall onto my cheek as he leaned close to inspect me. I had only thought it couldn't get any worse. That was when he pressed that finger to the cleft in my chin. He began to circle, the claw digging against my skin as he slid the nail around and around and around my face. It didn't hurt at first. At first, it was little more than a discomfort, and I began to wonder how long he had been carving at my wife before I woke up. I stared at him, and he stared back, those baby blue eyes boring into me. His eyes were mesmerizing, terrifying, as they held unwaveringly still. As the minutes stretched into hours, I began to feel my face heating up. It was subtle at first, just a little warmth around my chin and forehead, but as the circling finger went round and round and round, I felt like someone was holding a lighter on my skin. I would have screamed, my flesh becoming seared, but I couldn't move, and my horror was trapped in my throat. I started to feel the blood as it slid down my cheek. First, it was just a trickle, a damp line or two, but soon it ran in rivulets. Soon I could feel my flesh parting from my skull. Soon I could feel that sizzling heat as it cut my skin, and I felt as though I might pass out. I had to. I must black out from this shock. There was no way that everyone was awake as he cut their living face from their body. It was impossible. It was sick. It was... He pulled the finger back suddenly, and I realized with real horror what was about to happen. All 10 fingers gripped my flesh, and I tried to pull away. Maybe I could still make it to a hospital. They could fix me. They could make this right. There was no way he was going to take my face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. It wasn't supposed to... He gripped my face, and I heard that same Velcro ripping as my own skin came free of my skull. Then he devoured my wife's face as I watched, and slapped my own across the gore-soaked canvas that was his lumpy head. He hooted then. Hooted and cried in a strange, unknowable language. He turned to a deeper tunnel and cried out in pure pleasure as he fulfilled whatever ritual he was performing, whatever dark spell he needed these faces for. I hoped he would let me go now. I had lost a lot of blood, but maybe I could still get some medical attention. I felt groggy, but when I heard something struggling out of the depths of the tunnel, I felt something heavy settle into my guts. What fresh hell was this? Out of the darkness, lit only by whatever phosphorescence dwelled down here, came a hulking thing that slid on long gray limbs. It was spider-like, a massive gray blob that pulled itself along on something like tentacles. Each of them ended in the same hooked fingers as the creature. It lowered its equally mushy face to the creature, taking in the face he now wore, and I heard something speak in a voice made of broken glass. "Do's it please, oo mother? Do I please, oo mother?" it cried, and that voice was full of hope and terrible longing. The gray creature leaned in, seemed to contemplate for a long moment, before it opened its shapeless mouth and whispered a single horrible word in a language like snakes crawling across my naked face. Ugly. Then it pulled itself back into the depths, and I heard the creature sobbing as it fell to its gray knees and wept. Then, suddenly I was running. My mind had set itself to autopilot, and my body and mind just couldn't take it anymore. Myself pushed against this thing in its terrible need, and my body propelled itself away before this knowledge could do my brain lasting harm. I ran and ran, blind in that lightless world, as the blood leaked down my naked face. If the creature came after me, then I never knew. If the thing that wore my face came after me, I never knew. I was running 1 second, the darkness pressing in all around me, and the next my world was full of light, and I was falling into oblivion. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, being told just how lucky I was to be alive. An undercover cop had followed me to the underground entrance, and had waited to question me when I came back out. When I didn't come out for several hours, he called in people to look for me. Those people had heard me screaming through the tunnels, caught sight of my faceless form in their flashlights, and caught me just before I fell. I had nearly died on the way here. I had simply lost too much blood, and my body was in some kind of shock. They had sedated me, my night terrors causing me to buck and scream, and I had spent nearly a week in the hospital bed. No one thinks I'm crazy anymore. No one thinks I'm the killer anymore. Certainly, no one believes I cut my own damn face off. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone living in the area. Get out. Leave your home, and get out. The creature has no rhyme or reason for his actions. He seeks only to gain something that I believe he will never find. I'm safe now, a faceless horror who will have to live his life with the knowledge I discovered under the city that day. But you needn't suffer my fate. Get away from the cheap side. Get away from the concrete apartments. Get as far from the city as you can, lest you be one more face for this monster to show his mother. I'm not sure which was weirder, the fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was just so unimpressed with it. Dad had come home from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat down by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive like we always did. If this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, Mom should stay at home and keep the kids, and that everyone should look like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. I remember for a while, Mom met him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home. He eventually told her to stop so that the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's how he liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner and hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up at Mom to ask if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from a day at work, and he had just started asking us about our own day when he noticed our horrified looks. What? What's the matter? All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all so gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be so oblivious of something like that. In the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. Wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into the pavement than a wound. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. "Honey," Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, Did something happen at work today?" "No," Dad said, looking at her speculatively. "Well, Stubbins was changing the no-slip grating on the walkways, but that's really not that weird, I guess." Are you sure nothing odd happened today?" she asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. I guess, maybe, he seemed to think about it, there was this guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down, and he helped me up, but it was nothing. When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here. Dad, there's a huge hole in your freaking head. I was never what you'd call subtle. Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. What in the hell are you talking about? There's a hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that? Are you trying to be funny? 'Cause you know I don't like jokes. Despite his gruff tone, though, he began feeling around his forehead, as if trying to find the source of discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing it as a favor by looking at it in the first place. But when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it had hurt him, not really. It was more like the shudder you get when you have an itch and you scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment, before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding at it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing there. We found him at the kitchen table, eating his dinner like any other night. Sit down, your mother's meatloaf is getting cold, he told us, once he noticed we were there. Dad, I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital? Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deep, phlegmy way. Doctor won't be able to do anything but poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not going to no doctor. Now sit down and eat. Then he went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and ate as well. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never did. Well, that's not entirely true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle and 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often and smiled daily. It's just hard to tell with your father. He's not quite as obvious about it as the rest of us are. After that, I started paying more attention to Dad, and I'd come to the point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumble when he chuckled, the minute crinkling at the edges of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when my dad was in a good mood, and when he felt less like hitting and more like patting, when you could ask him for a favor, when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned, and it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff upside the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Raymond bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract, as though it were breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized he had caught me staring. Either go to bed or stop staring at me. You're creeping me out. I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as that hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, I guess, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went outside. I wished he would wear it inside, too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. It wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone's staring at you. It looked like it was getting bigger, too. But if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it, his only exception to ignoring it being the hat he wore outside. Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, it had been maybe big enough to put your pinky finger inside. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it means to go away, it'll do it on its own. He went to work, came home, watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I I found myself looking at my father more and more often, that gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even when his hat was on. I started having dreams about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around to look at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, that eye stared at me until I came awake, gasping. Then one day, he came to breakfast, and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. It wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, a crater, that just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. Mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respiration as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending like nothing was wrong, but it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name, and left for work with his breakfast only half eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it and would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down to breakfast late since I knew he'd be at work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of strange whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I didn't understand. The words were alien, harsh, and unwantable, but I felt I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I would have moved out. Then about a month and a half after the spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way her eyes looked told me something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and wouldn't find out till later it was because Dad had locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there bumping around. Mom would leave food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notebook upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag, when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway up, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding, and my brother and I had been very curious about what was happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and scrambled slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my father's back, clad in a bathrobe and knee socks, as he bent over for the day's breakfast tray that my mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that she had set beside the bowl of oatmeal. Then he stood up, and I had to put my hand over my mouth as he came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes they used to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep, and as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and took the tray back into the bedroom, but when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much the last few days. In my dream, the hole always had an eye, but in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat on my left, my mom sat on my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing father's clothes, and the food he ate was pushed into the circle hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left out in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine like a corpse's. The teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind, and when its face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose in an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened and a low whisper began to assault my ears. Every night, that whisper became a little louder, and over time, I came to understand the words, "Shally shally may ray, fory fory may gra, Raleigh Grega, Su Raleigh Drema. The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dream meant, but I knew that they were meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me the whole time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words it spoke to myself during the day. I would catch myself making little rhymes out of it, and they were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do, and one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a long time. There was a noise coming from inside, and it sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in there and gotten hurt, but I think even then, I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest. He was lying on the floor, flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk, probably couldn't even see, but he seemed to understand that I was there to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shali Shali Rema, Fori Fori Megra, Li Raleigh Grega, Su Raleigh Drema. As the words fell from me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried it would be the huge eye, like the one I'd seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy, as his leathery skin slid from the dark pool. Below the dark pit that had made up my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was, and when his withered feet touched down on the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing, and tittered as he pulled it around himself. "Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing in his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you." Then he left, just walked out of our house and into the night. As the sun comes up over my mother's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of this experience as possible, so I won't forget any of it. But it's so weird, and it's hard to put it all into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. I need to tell someone about this, mostly to get it off my chest, but also because, screwed up as the situation is, it's one of the best stories I've ever heard. I attend a large university in Arizona. I won't say which, but my friends and I were sharing a bottle of Jack the other night, and we started sharing stories. Somehow, we got on the subject of spooky stories, and it appeared that several of us had a strange occurrence to talk about. Gabriel told us about a weird apartment that he and his mother had lived in when they were in West Virginia. Apparently his mother had woken up screaming one night after a dark figure had appeared over her bed. He had come in and found it melting away into nothing, and the two of them had moved out shortly thereafter. John told us about a weird deer he'd seen on a hunting trip, and I told him about a sound I'd heard outside my parents' house in Montana throughout my childhood. One of Dad's friends, he was a zoologist or something, said it didn't sound like any animal he was familiar with. Dad jokingly asked him if it was a Bigfoot or something. He never really quite denied it. He got spooky quiet and just said he wouldn't be caught out dead in the woods, especially not after dark. We never went camping out there anymore, but we certainly never went past the property line either after dark. Passed the bottle to Samuel, and for once, he actually took a sip. Samuel, or Sam for short, had been living in the dorm since before we'd arrived at university. He was in his third year and was studying engineering as he worked towards a bachelor's degree. He had told us several stories about growing up in a small town in Mexico and how his uncle was thanks to his current status as a student. His uncle was a professor of Spanish studies and antiquities, and he had offered to help his nephew get a student visa so he could do more than drink shitty beer in the local bar and do manual labor his whole life. I opened up saying that it was weird to see Samuel drink, but I don't think you understand how strange it was. Samuel was our permanent designated driver because in the 2 years that we'd known him, I had never so much as seen him touch a bottle of alcohol, unless it was to throw it away or take it from us when we had enough. He took a moment to collect his thoughts before saying in a hollow voice, "I told you all I grew up in Mexico, right?" We all nodded. He continued, "Well, I grew up in this rural little town right outside of Hermosillo. It wasn't large, maybe 8,000 people in the whole town, and most of our work came from the processing plant or from the farms that operated around the small town. My mother and I lived there with my abuelo and my abuela. My uncle was living in America and sending money back when he could. My abuelo was a horse breeder, something my family had practiced for generations, and he would work for the stockman for one of the larger ranches in the area. We weren't quite as well off as the rancher, but we were doing okay. Wasn't a bad life. It was hard, but not without its pleasures. When I was in high school, my friends and I would go to parties held at the local farms. The rancher's son, Santiago, and I had been friends since we were young, and we palled around with some of the ranch hand sons, Juan, Christopher, and Mateo. We were good friends, probably the best friends I've ever had, but one night we found something that none of us quite believed in. We had all grown up with stories about La Llorona or El Cibon, but my mother always loved to use a certain legend to scare me. La Lechuza was a witch who turned herself into some sort of owl demon after her death. She was said to roam the lands, hunting for drunks or just children out after dark. She would make noises in the night to trick you into opening your window so she could steal your eyes. She would pretend to be a baby to lure you into the woods. She would create thunderstorms and other nasty things and would come to get naughty children if they acted out. La Lechuza was used a lot in my house to get me to do things like chores or homework that I really didn't want to do. By the time I was a teenager, though, I was kind of done with my mom's scary stories about owl ladies. I was much more interested in drinking with my friends and meeting girls. I was 16 when she caught me on my way out the door. "I know where you're going off to. I beg you, do not go out there and drink with your friends." I brushed her off, saying I was of age, and if I wanted to go hang out with my friends, then I would. And if La Lechuza would happen across you in your group? I scoffed, telling her that her stories didn't scare me anymore. "That story is what killed your father," she started to say, but I cut her off. Dad had died in a drunk driving accident before I was born. He had driven off the road and hit a tree, his car erupting into a ball of flame, and that's why we had nothing to bury. But Mom had insisted that it had been La Lechuza who had driven him off the road. This had made me even scareder of the creature when I was a kid, but now it made me mad that she would use my father's death like this. I left without another word, climbing into Santiago's car as it pulled away from my house for the last time. She was standing in the road crying as we drove off. That image will be scarred into my brain until the day I die. We were out late. I couldn't tell you much about the party, just that it was in someone's barn. The beer was hot, the women were lukewarm, and the music was subpar at best. I drank too much, trying to get the fight with my mom out of my head, and by the time we called it a night, I was well and truly drunk. We climbed into Santiago's car, all of us laughing and tipsy. We started out, Santiago managing to keep it on the road, as we whooped and hollered in the back seat. He was laughing along with us, turning the music up on the radio, but when he swerved suddenly, we all screamed like banshees. He hauled us back on the road, Mateo opening the window to vomit, and I leaned up as I asked him what was wrong. He looked pale, all the tipsy scared out of him as he stammered, I thought there was an old lady in the road, but when she turned, her body looked wrong. I said how weird it was to see someone so old out this late, but suddenly I yelled for him to look. Something was in the road, and if it was what he had seen before, he had been absolutely right. It was hunched over, a long cloak on its shoulders, and it looked deformed. It turned to look at the car as it barreled forward, and I could see piercing red eyes that bore into my soul. I saw it all in the space of 5 seconds, maybe, but those eyes will stay with me forever. Santiago never had a chance to do anything. He just plowed right into her, doing 55. The car suddenly stopped dead, and I came to about a minute later. I had boffed my head pretty good on the seat, but one look at Santiago told me I had gotten off lucky. He had slammed into the windshield, breaking his neck and turning his skull into a rotten gourd. The others seemed to be okay, but the car was smoking, and we climbed out as we assessed the damage. The whole front end was smashed in like we'd hit a tree or a big rock, but nothing was in the road to be hit. I remembered the old lady and moved off to check the ditches, thinking maybe we had knocked her off the road. The others just milled about, not sure what to do, and that's when it happened. The moon was full that night, or I may very well have missed it. A shadow passed over me, a thing with a wingspan like a condor, and I looked up just in time to see it drop onto my friends as they stood huddled around the car. It had landed on Juan, breaking his back and riding him to the ground. He screamed, watery and miserable. He wouldn't scream for long, though. The bird dropped its head and began to feed on him, its beak plunging and diving as the other two backed away in horror. When it looked up, face dripping blood and owl eyes glaring at me, I ran. I don't know if the other two ran at the time, but I felt like a mouse who'd seen an owl. I ran, still drunk and weaving, and the houses swam up in my peripherals. I could still hear that wet, crunching sound as the creature fed, and I stumbled as my feet hit a root. I kept running, kept moving, kept showing my heels as the houses wobbled like an oil painting all around me. I just kept running, knowing that my house couldn't be far, not noticing the lack of night sounds until it was too late. When that unearthly screech split the night, I panicked and turned a corner at random. When my foot hit a pothole, I thought for sure I was going to die. My world suddenly exploded with light, and I stumbled back on my hands and butt as a bright something nearly blinded me. I turned, putting my back to those blinding lights, and saw a horror as it descended. The headlights spotlighted the owl thing, and as it swooped down on me, I figured this was the end. I closed my eyes and put my hands up across my face, preparing for the end. That's when I heard my mom yelling at the thing. She came out of the car, shouting curses and brandishing a cross on a long silver chain. The owl monster flapped its wings, changing its course and taking off again. It screeched loudly, flapping those wings angrily as it flew away. My mother helped me into the car then, but I must have passed out, because I woke up in my bed the next morning. I would have believed it was a dream if Mom hadn't told me all about it as we sat at the breakfast table. She had made food, and there was a pot of coffee there as well. As I ate, she told me all of it. How the creature had killed my dad one night as he drove home drunk. How Santiago and Juan had been found dead that morning. How my other friends had never arrived home that night. She spelled it out for me and told me how lucky I was to be alive. She said I had been given a chance and that it was up to me to figure out how to use it. She wasn't happy with my answer after I'd thought about it for a few days, but I think she understood. I still went to those parties, but I never drank again. Instead, I helped people get home safely. I never saw that creature again, but there were nights that I imagined I could feel its hateful stare. I was taking its prey from it, stealing its food, and it never quite forgave me for that. Not a day goes by that I don't think about that night and my friends who died. We sat there, drinking as we listened to his story, a cold chill flowing through us as we took it all in. I'd say this was the end, but that wouldn't do him or his story justice. 3 weeks ago, Samuel came to me in tears and told me that his mother was going to die. I sat him down. He was shaking like a leaf, and asked him how he could possibly know that. Before that, I hadn't seen him in class in a few days, and he looked tired and rattled. I dreamed I was in my mother's house, the one she has on my grandparents' property, and I heard her crying. I walked into the living room, and she was sitting at the kitchen table. I walked up behind her, putting a hand on her shoulder, and asked her what was wrong. She grabbed my arm, and her hand had become a claw. Her head turned around, and she screeched at me through that owl beak. Her face had become that of the owl witch, and just before I woke up, she screamed my mother's name. I asked him what that meant, and he said, "Some people say that seeing her in a dream means that someone you love will die. She screamed my mother's name. I can't ignore that." 3 days later, he told me he was returning home for his mother's funeral. They found her in her room. She'd had a heart attack. I need to go home and say goodbye. Will you watch my plants while I'm away? I told him I would, but I think he knew he wasn't coming back. A week ago, I asked his uncle if there was any news. His uncle only sighed and told me that his nephew was missing. My mother tells me that he went to the house he and his mother had shared. No one has seen him since. We don't know where he is, but if you're still watering his plants, I'll pick them up this afternoon. Hopefully, I can give them to him when he comes back. I don't know what became of Sam, but I pray that the owl witch, La Lechuza, did not get him. I hadn't thought about it until last week, but it seems to have snowballed into something that's gotten out of control. I was looking through some photos while helping my mom move when I saw him for the first time in 15 years. Dad had passed away a few months ago, and Mom was just starting to clean out some of his things. The picture had been taken at a birthday party, my 9th birthday party, to be exact, and it showed my friends and I standing in front of the house and smiling as my mom took the picture. There were about 9 of us, all wearing party hats and ice cream mustaches under our noses, but the happy faces of my friends and I weren't what had caught my eye. It was the gaunt man standing in the window of the living room, the one looking out at us with the empty black eyes and the sinister little smile, the man who had haunted my childhood, though I'd never quite believed in him after the age of 12, Mr. Danver, a spectre that my late father had brought to life. I remember the first time I had ever even heard of Mr. Danver, and the memory made my skin crawl. It wasn't scary because of what I had been told, but because of the unwilling way that my father had shared it. I had been 5, and we were getting ready to go to preschool. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I was cranky as I sat at the table and picked at my breakfast. I was wearing half my school clothes, 1 sock, 1 shoe, and I was so far from being ready that when my dad saw me, you could tell that he knew we were going to be late. "Come on, kiddo, we need to get moving. Finish your breakfast, get your clothes on, find your shoes, let's get on the road." I don't remember what I said to him, something snarky and grumpy, and when he turned back to me, he spoke before he had quite made up his mind to. "You better hurry and get ready before Mr. Danver comes to get you." The silence that hung after that statement was enough to make me turn my head and look at him, and that's why I saw when he slowly put a hand over his mouth. He was looking at me like he'd just sworn, and he was afraid that I would start repeating it. He seemed terrified of what might suddenly come out of my mouth. "Who's Mr. Danver?" I asked, and that seemed to seal the deal. Dad went rigid, not all at once, but slowly, like something petrifying. His eyes stared out at nothing, his mouth opening a little bit as he gasped slightly. His body seemed to be trying to fight whatever was going on and failing, his mind railing against the inevitable. He looked like a landed fish, something struggling to breathe, even as it struggles with the hook that has pulled it from the water of life. And when I asked the question a second time, the hook seemed to find its anchor, and he stopped fighting. He comes for bad kids, naughty kids, kids who don't listen. He finds where they hide, and they go missing. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He's tall and old, with skin so thin. His hair is wisps, gray as tin. His teeth are sharp, his eyes are black. He'll drag you off, and you'll never come back. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He delivered it all in the well-trained cadence of an off-Broadway actor at an audition. It sounded like something he had repeated 1,000 times, and I realized then that it was something I'd never forget. The scariest part about it wasn't what he had said. It was how he had said it. The voice was so different from Dad's that it was like watching a ventriloquist talk through him. Suddenly, it felt like a stranger was in the house, and I shuddered as a cold chill ran through me. I didn't say anything in the face of that silence, but when I lifted a hand to my eyes, I realized I was crying. Large, silent tears were sliding down my face, and as my dad came out of his trance, he started crying too. He came to scoop me into his arms and pressed me to his chest as he repeated the same thing again and again and again into my corn silk hair. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm so sorry. When Mom came home to find us both watching Disney movies on the couch, she asked why he had called out of work and not taken me to school. When he explained the situation in soft tones as he pressed his mouth against her ear, she joined us on the couch and pulled me into her lap. That was the first night I saw the old spectre, but it wouldn't be the last. I woke up with the most profound chill I'd ever felt. It ran up my cheeks like mice feet, and my eyes popped open as I lay in bed. The room was dark, my toys casting shadows across the floor as the moon crept in through the window. But I knew those spooky shapes were not the source of my discomfort. I could almost imagine that I heard the song Dad had sung as it scampered in with the air conditioner in the vents. I could see the dust motes in the moonbeams as they boogied to that haunted chorus, and as I stared at them, that's when I saw him. He was hunkered in the corner, his knees against his chest, his arms resting on his knees. He was looking at me from the pit of shadows where he sat, and when he realized I was looking back at him, I saw a wide grin stretch across his face. His toothy mouth stretched ear to ear, and as he stood up, I could hear his joints popping like kindling wood. His hair set neatly on his head, looking like the hair you saw on zombies in horror movies, and it brushed the ceiling as he stood up. He rose until his head nestled in the corner of that ceiling, his frame all of 8 feet tall. He had a hat in his hand, a hat I would later learn was called a bowler, and his arms were covered in a rich brown suit coat. He was wearing a suit beneath it, but I was only vaguely aware of it. As he rose, the moon casting his features in contrast, I was mesmerized by his eyes. They were dark pits of shadow that looked at me with mirthful knowledge. "Sorry to wake you," he said, his voice sounding like someone who's lost their breath to excitement. "I just wanted a peek. I'm sure I'll get a closer look sometime. Toodaloo." I started screaming then, and when Dad came in and turned the light on, there was nothing in the corner but the star stickers that stuck to the ceiling above the spot. Those stickers never glowed again, and I took them down when I noticed and threw them away. I was afraid he had gotten his taint on them. Dad pulled me into a hug, Mom beside him, hugging me in an instant, and both of them held me until the shaking stopped. After that, I saw him any time I did something disobedient. Sometimes I would see him lurking in the corners of my vision if I said something smart to my mom or dad. Sometimes I would feel those black eyes watching me if I didn't do my chores. There was a time when I heard him laughing after I'd gotten angry at my mom, and I was always quick to apologize and make things right. Mr. Danver made me conscious of my actions in a way that I'd never been before, and I was a better person because of it, I suppose. I never saw him when I was rude to my friends, but just the knowledge that he might be watching me made me forgive more often, and I was less likely to be cruel to others. Sometimes when I thought about cheating on a test or taking something from a store, I would imagine him just waiting to get me and think better of it. It all culminated when I was 12, on the day I ran away from home. I'd been looking forward to a sleepover at my friend's house that weekend, an event that was highly anticipated. Matt had one of these for his birthday every year, and a bunch of us would go to his house and eat junk food and watch movies and tell scary stories and just have the times of our lives. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, and I knew that if Mom found the math test at the bottom of my bag, the one with the big red F on it, I could hang it up. I'd buried it deep in my backpack, but not deep enough, apparently. She had found it before I could make my escape to the party, and we had gotten into a screaming match over it. It was unfair, I told her. I'd looked forward to this party for so long, and it wasn't fair that now I didn't get to go. She said that was too bad, and if parties were more important than schoolwork, then I needed to get my priorities in order. I was so mad, so furious with my mom, that I did the unthinkable before I could remember the spectre of Mr. Danver. I told her I was going whether she gave me permission or not, and walked out the door before she could stop me. I ran up the street, heading for Matt's house, listening to my mom call from behind me. I expected her to be angry. I expected her to be upset. Instead, she just sounded scared. She told me to come back, that we could talk about this, but I was in no mood to listen. I was going to the party, whether she liked it or not, and nothing was going to stop me from getting there. It wasn't until I saw him standing under a burnt-out streetlight that I remembered the looming spectre of Mr. Danver. When it began to flicker, I realized it had a little more juice in it. In the flickering light, I could see the tall, thin frame as he grinned at me, his translucent skin clinging to his face like a mask. He had his hat in his hand again, his immaculate suit still looking pristine in the flickering light, and his eyes reflected that flicker like a stuffed animal's. He looked unreal, standing in the everyday world, like a piece of Halloween decor that's a little too well made. He was utterly still, his head brushing the bottom of the lamp, but his fingers gave away his excitement. They drummed on the brim of his hat and made him look like a dog preparing to yank his lead and give chase. We stood looking at each other for a count of 5 before I turned and shot off towards home. Mr. Danver was coming after me just as quick, but his lack of footfalls made me panic all the more. I turned to look and saw the too-tall thing eating up the ground. His long legs moved like a spider's, and he ran like a cartoon character in big, exaggerated galumphs. He was gaining on me with every step, his strides twice my own, and I screamed in frustration and terror as I put on an extra burst of speed. To think that a moment of frustration was going to seal my fate forever. I'd been hyperfixated on my behavior for so long, and now a sudden lapse in judgment was going to kill me. "When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware." The wind seemed to bring the hateful words to my mind as it rushed past my ears. "When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared." I was scared. I was terrified. When my house came into view, I was afraid that I would get snatched within view of the front door. Mr. Danver would reach out with one long arm and pull me into the darkness, and I'd be gone forever. It would happen just that quick, and no one would know what had gotten me. Correction, my parents would know. They would know, but how would they tell anyone? To admit to such would make them sound nuts and probably make people think that they were responsible for my disappearance. I turned suddenly, going through the gate and running up the walk, and I felt the icy chill of Mr. Danver's hand as it passed inches from me. I took the steps 2 at a time, praying the door would be unlocked, and when Mom threw it open, I leapt into her arms. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please don't let him take me." I pressed my face against her, not daring to look back into the yard. Mom whispered that she forgave me, but when she talked to Mr. Danver, her voice was a mixture of rage and an old fear. "Get out of here. All's forgiven. There's no misdeed. You cannot take him." I kept my face pressed against my mom, but I still heard Mr. Danver's spidery voice when he answered her. "Another time, then." When I peeked back, he was gone. Dad came home an hour later, getting off work early after Mom called him, but I was still shaking and sobbing on the couch. "Why?" I asked him when he came in. "Why did you tell me about Mr. Danver?" My dad was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer, before sighing and saying, "'Cause it's not something I meant to do. It happens. Someday it'll happen to you too as well." "Never. I would never do that to my child." I shuddered as he wrapped me in a hug, but I didn't pull away. "Sweetie, you won't have a choice." I didn't have a choice. My father didn't have a choice. No one has a choice. Once you know about him, the knowledge demands to be shared. His name is dark knowledge, a secret shared by many, and it must be served. That was when he told me how he had come to know about Mr. Danver from his father. I was playing with something on the couch when Dad told me to clean my room. I ignored him, wanting to finish my game, and when he said if I didn't go do it now, he would call Mr. Danver, I looked up, and when he said it, the look on his face was both confused and afraid. Dad, your grandpa, wasn't always the nice guy that you know. He joined AA when I was in high school, but before that he was a drunk. He could be mean when he was drunk, too, and I should have known better than to hesitate when he asked me to do something. Instead, I asked who Mr. Danver was, and when he sang me the little song, it was the soberest I'd ever seen him up until that point. The words were forced out of him like vomit, and when he finished, he threw his arms around me and told me how sorry he was. Dad looked at me, and his eyes were hollow pits. I saw him in my room that night, and it wasn't the last time either. He told me that when he'd told the story to Mom, the one about his father telling him about Mr. Danver, she'd cried and said that she'd seen him too. Her dad told her too, "One day you'll tell your kids. You won't want to, but you won't have a choice. The song is as inevitable as Mr. Danver." "What you got there?" I jumped as Mom came in and found me looking at the picture. I put it in my pocket, not wanting to remind her about Mr. Danver if I could help it. I moved to another box, Mom taking the box of photos I'd been looking through, and I tried to put the name out of my mind. It was easy to do as I worked, but as I sat at home later, still sore from a day of moving furniture and sorting boxes, I started thinking about it. If my parents and I knew about Mr. Danver, did anyone else? I pulled up Reddit and made the post before I could think better of it. I didn't know if you could transfer the knowledge like that, but I wanted to know bad enough to find out. "Hey guys, I remembered something from when I was a kid. I just wanted to know if anyone else had heard of it." My dad told me a spooky story about Mr. Danver when I was a kid, saying he would come get me. My mom knew about it too, but I was wondering if it was something anyone else had heard of, or if it was something that he made up. The post had barely sat for 5 minutes before I got a response. It wasn't the last either. Yeah, my dad told me about him too when I was little. Seems like I must have had nightmares about it, 'cause I can remember dreaming he was in the corner of my room sometimes. OMG, so weird. That was exactly what my mom called it too. It was weird when she told me too. I thought she was having a seizure. My uncle used to tell me that he would come get me if I was bad. Wasn't there a song or a poem that went along with it too? Yeah, it was pretty catchy, but I can't remember all the words. On and on and on. The thread had about 100 comments, and not all of them were Americans either. Mr. Danver seemed to be something that lived in the consciousness of most English-speaking people, and even if it had a different name, the descriptions they gave were exactly the same. Tall, suited, pale, wispy hair, sharp teeth, black eyes. The description was universal, and the idea that I wasn't alone didn't make me feel any better. If you too have experienced Mr. Danver, then it's already too late. One day you'll tell your kids. One day they will have the knowledge. One day, if they're lucky enough to avoid the icy grip of Mr. Danver, they'll pass it on. The cycle always continues, whether you want it to or not. One day, I too will infect my child with the looming spectre of Mr. Danver. I envy these kids nowadays. That probably makes me sound like an old fart, but they really do have a lot more options than we did when we were their age. My youngest is neurodivergent, while my oldest has ADHD, which is bad enough to sometimes give him terrible anxiety. We have any number of things around the house to help with said anxiety. Poppets, fidget spinners, fidget cubes, sensory blankets, you name it, and we probably have it somewhere. My youngest son picked them up early, and they seemed to help him cope with the stress that his autism often brought on. My oldest scoffed at the gadgets my son had, but he left them lying around, and my oldest started playing with them too. Now he doesn't go anywhere without his fidget cube, and his hands seem glued to it around test time. All I had when I was his age was a worry stone, and I probably worried away more than a quarry of them. So when my youngest left his Karmagami on the living room floor one afternoon, my first exposure to it wasn't exactly positive. If you're unaware of what those are, they're these little revolving toys that have different patterns on each of the faces. As you rotate it, the picture changes, and the transitioning images are supposed to be soothing. That, however, was not my initial reaction to them. He had left it in the living room floor beside the couch, right in a blind spot. So as I came around the corner one day, wanting to get a little lunch from the kitchen, I stepped down on the pokey end of the toy. After a few minutes of cursing and hopping around, I was ashamed to see that I had broken my son's new favorite sensory toy. I looked at the time and realized I only had about an hour to find a new one before he came home and had a fit. Quick trip to Walmart and $10 bought me an exact copy, but before I could leave, one of them caught my eye. It was a galaxy scene, the stars and nebulas giving me a strange, serene feeling. I decided to buy one for myself, feeling a little silly for wanting a kid's toy, but getting over it pretty quickly. As I sat at my desk and flipped through the scenes of open space, I felt a serenity I hadn't known since I was very young. I have a certain amount of anxiety myself, and the weird rotating thing soothed me when it all became too much. My wife rolled her eyes at me a little, but I noticed she wasn't in any hurry to get rid of her fidget cube either. So it sat on my desk, and there it was well used and well loved. At least, until recently. I've been working on a book for the last couple of years, and it was finally beginning to come together. It was polished. The test readers I'd let have a look at it said they couldn't wait for the next chapter, and I was excited to get the final draft to my editor after so long. As I edited it, The little toy became the object most often at hand. I would turn it over and over without thinking about it, the galaxy spinning as my tale spun itself closer and closer to completion. I was turning it as I worked my way through the last fourth of the book, when something besides the swirl of the heavens caught my eye. I looked down, seeing the corner of the starry sky, and then I saw something on the face that was not the Galileo space probe or a black hole. It was eyes. I dropped the thing in surprise, but I had definitely seen a pair of bloodshot eyes. I could swear the veins had pulsed a little, the pupils staring at me, and I had been so startled by the intrusion that I picked my feet up into my chair like I thought it might bite me. I reached down after a few seconds of sitting like that, feeling silly, and when I picked it back up, I could see the familiar black hole and space probe among the bed of stars. I shook it off, thinking I'd just been working too hard. Started flipping the little toy in my hand again. As the words began to fall comfortably into place, I forgot about the eyes. I put it off as an optical illusion. It kept spinning and spinning, stopping only to make edits or change something here and there, and I didn't think about it again until later that night. I was talking with my editor on the phone, telling her about my progress and playing with the Karmagami, when it happened again. I figured I've got about 10 more chapters before I'm done with the third draft. I think then I might be ready to pass it to the proofreader, so we can make it ready for publication. The absent-minded flipping was cathartic, my hands busy as my mind whirled over the things I still needed to do. I had to finish the second draft, get the cover art finished, get the final page count, and as I thought about it, my fingers flicked the little toy around and around. The spacescape spun faster and faster, the stars practically winking as I talked to Edith about the upcoming book. I'd forgotten about the eyes, chalking it up to stress, and the little thing hadn't been far from my hand since. "That's great, kid. If they're anything like the last pages you sent me, I can't wait to see them. Did you fix the problem you've been having with the third part?" "Yeah, I think so. I changed it so Mark and Ted move away while he kills Taylor. But the little toy had nearly slipped through my sweaty fingers, and I looked down to see the eyes staring up at me again. They were boring into me, judging me as they glared daggers into my Notre Dame t-shirt. As I watched the eyes, something emerged from the lower lip of the device, and I yelped as something bit me. I dropped the Karmagami and the phone I was talking on, looking down at my bleeding thumb as I shuddered on the couch. My wife and youngest son looked over at me, not sure what had happened, and I heard Edith from the floor asking what was going on. I reached for the phone, but my hands were shaking as the bite on my thumb bled. I apologized for the surprise, but the rest of my answer was a little less excited. When I felt my thumb throb, I looked down to find that the thing was back in my hand. I wanted to drop it, but I just couldn't make my hand release it. The space scene was back again. The eyes and teeth were gone, but my hands shook a little as I flipped through the pictures. I spoke absent-mindedly to Edith, but my eyes kept flicking down to the little puzzle toy. I expected to see the eyes again, but when the call ended, I let the phone slide down to the cushions and took the Karmagami in both hands again. "Boy," my wife said, "you sure are interested in that thing tonight." I nodded, but I felt a little cold as I kept flipping. My fingers felt crampy as I spun the image, unable to stop myself, and it no longer brought me the peace of mind that it once had. This was more like the feeling I used the device to forget, and the longer I held it, the more it made the emotions in me circle like a tornado. I had eyes only for the changing colors and patterns, and as they scrolled, I saw the depths of space open up, and the eyes returned to judge me. They swirled like galaxies all their own, the white orbs climbing up out of the depths of the void. The veins pulsed in the pale pools, beating to the tune of their own phantom heartbeat. I wanted to stop, but I was powerless as I saw that Cheshire Cat's smile
oozing up as well. The teeth grinned wetly, drawing up at the corners as they ogled me. The teeth groaned like trees in a high wind, the mouth becoming a rictus as it continued to grow. The closer it came, the faster my hands moved. My fingers cramped, but they still worked as a blurry mechanism, faster and faster, closer and closer, the eyes and mouth rising from the void as my movements seemed to summon them into the world. I couldn't tell if I was leaning in closer or they were getting bigger, but the longer I turned it, the more it encompassed my whole existence. When someone suddenly covered the object in my hand, taking it away from me in one smooth motion, I was both relieved and infuriated. I was in bed, completely unsure of how I'd gotten there, with my wife looking down on me with concern. "I think you've played with your toy enough for one night," she said, taking it over to my desk and setting it down. I smiled at her, a single tear sliding down my face, but inside, I wanted to jump up and throttle her. For the first time in my life, I wanted to hit her. I wanted to slam her head against the desk until she stopped moving, and then I wanted to pick up that toy and start moving the pieces again. I railed against the feelings, but they kept surging forward like eels just below the surface. She must have seen something when she looked back, because she paused before coming back to bed. Her look was strange, almost fearful, but she settled as I adjusted my face into something more normal. "What's gotten into you lately?" she asked, coming to bed as I pulled myself back to reality. "Just working too much lately," I stuttered, getting up as I got into my pajamas. Even as I got ready, I couldn't help but glance at the Karmagami. It was just sitting there, calling to me, begging to be touched, but I turned away as I went to lay next to my wife. The urge to hurt her had passed, and as we settled into bed, I felt like my old self again. I just needed a little distance from my favorite worry stone, and as I drifted off, I made a mental note to just let it sit there tomorrow. I closed my eyes and opened them in a dream void. I was floating naked in space, a long umbilicus sprouting from my navel. I was drifting, moving towards the last thing I expected to find out there. It got bigger the closer I floated, and I expected that it would suddenly burst open and reveal a bright flash of light. Maybe this was where the eyes came drifting from, though I'd certainly never seen it on the stickered background of my fidget toy. The door was massive, roughly 20 feet tall, and it only got bigger the closer I got. As it loomed up before me, I suddenly found myself not wanting to sit in that shadow. I didn't understand how it still had a shadow. Did things have shadows in space? I didn't know, but I didn't want to come anywhere near this thing, as little say as I seemed to have in the matter. It opened suddenly, as I had expected, bathing my eyes in star-dazzling light. As I shaded my eyes to see what was coming through, I saw those glittering teeth as they opened wide and came down loudly around me. I came awake with a deep gasp, finding only my sleeping wife in the dark room. It was still on the desk then, that hateful pyramid, but I don't believe it stayed there long. When I woke up the next morning, my fingers ached, and I was already spinning the galaxies in my hand. My arms were shaking from exertion, the eyes and mouth already growing as they threatened to break the bonds of the Karmagami. I threw it away before I could think better of it, and when it burst against the wall, my wife snorted before falling back asleep. I just sat there for a moment, hands extended, not sure where I'd found the nerve. It was the last thing I had wanted to do, but now that it was star-strewn pieces on the ground, I felt more at peace than I had in days. It couldn't haunt me anymore, couldn't make my fingers cramp, my head ache, but even as I slid back under the covers, I could feel my fingers wanting to work the puzzle yet again. When I woke up and found it sitting on the desk, right where my wife had left it, I almost cried. Over the next few days, the little thing was my obsession, despite my better judgment. If I was awake, the little puzzle was spinning in my hands. My pages were forgotten, my family ignored. I couldn't help it. My mind was consumed by nothing so much as freeing whatever was trapped inside this thing, even though I was truly terrified of it. I would come to the precipice, the eyes ready to pop free of the canvas which held them, only to drop it before the snapping teeth could bite me. I would resist its pull for a few minutes, an hour at the most, but then I'd come to and find it in my hand yet again. My wife stopped nagging me about it after the second day, just sighing disgustedly anytime she saw me fiddling with it. At some point, she left to take the kids to school, and they didn't come back. I was aware of them the same way I was aware that every 8 hours I needed to eat, but I don't think it truly registered as something to be worried about. The phone was ignored, sometimes my body functions as well, and before long I was simply sitting on the living room floor in my own filth, my fingers rustling the drapes a little as they worked the picture at an eye-watering pace. I'm in one of my little breaks now, the device thrown against the wall as I try to resist the urge to use it. I took the time to get this down, hoping it would find someone, anyone, who might be having a similar problem. Sometimes the things that bring us joy are also the thing that destroys us. I don't know what sort of otherworldly being resides in this hunk of plastic and adhesive pictures, but it gets closer and closer to being born every time I pick the Karmagami up. For your own sake, if you ever see the eyes, don't fall into the same trap that has me. If you see the eyes, throw it away and forget it by any means possible.